All right, we're back again, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, to talk about the Declaration of Independence. You know, the most important breakup letter in the history of the world. So stick with me and we will jump right into it on the next slide. Okay, I know this is a wall of text, but stick with me here. On July 2nd of 1776, the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, adopted a resolution that stated, quote, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved." Then, okay, so that's on July 2nd. Then on July 4th of 1776, the Second Continental Congress approves the Declaration of Independence. And the first thing we're going to look at is this excerpt on your screen. Okay, I am going to read it to you. Here we go. "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." End quote. That's a really, those two paragraphs are beautifully structured. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson was probably one of the greatest writers. But these are the two paragraphs that we're really going to be looking at, okay? They're probably the most well known. And the reason why they're up here is because I refuse to let you leave my class thinking that, when somebody tweets something like, when it becomes, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which connected them to another, that you're like, oh my God, these people are calling for an overthrow. No, they're just quoting the Declaration of Independence, okay? But in the Declaration, it says a lot of things, and we, on the next slide, are going to jump into what this means. In this formal statement announcing the severed ties between the 13 colonies and Great Britain, Thomas Jefferson wrote of a government in which the government itself was expected and required to protect the natural rights of citizens. In this document, the leaders outlined the reasons for declaring independence from England. So it's not just, a bunch of fancy words, it's actually a list of grievances as well. Now, since Thomas Jefferson's writing of the Declaration, many groups have interpreted the document, and frequently the Declaration has been used to justify other political and social movements. However, the Declaration of Independence initially represented the colonists' deepest fears and beliefs. And this is important to remember. The colonists believed that they saw a clear pattern of oppression in the events that followed the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. Okay, they believed that they saw an evil and deliberate conspiracy to crush liberty in America. And they saw evidence of this conspiracy in acts like the Stamp Act and the tea taxes and the Coercion Acts. The ideas in the Declaration of Independence weren't new, as we are often led to believe. They are beliefs and attitudes that led to the call for independence. These had been around for a long time, but not only that, it had been an important part of colonial life almost since the establishment of the 13 colonies. And here's why. Of all the political thinkers that influenced American beliefs about government, the most important one was a 17th century English philosopher named John Locke. The most important contributions of Locke were his ideas regarding the relationship between government and natural rights, which were believed to be God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because the Declaration of Independence literally says, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So John Locke's does include property, whereas ours includes the pursuit of happiness, but that's probably just wordsy and it sounds better. Locke was not the first Englishman to suggest that people had rights. In fact, the British government had recognized that it did have a duty to protect the rights, or at least the lives, the liberties, and the property of English citizens long before it decided to settle North America. Okay, for example, in 1215, King John, like the same one from Robin Hood, signed something called the Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta was a promise to his subjects that he and future monarchs would refrain from certain actions that harmed or had the potential to harm the people of England. It was the first time that the English government said, you know what, you have rights, and it is the English government's responsibility to protect your rights, to make sure that we do not bring direct harm to you or the potential for harm. Now, prominent in the Magna Carta's many provisions are protections for life, liberty, and property. For example, one of the document's most famous clauses promises, quote, "No free man shall be taken, imprisoned, or in any way destroyed, except by lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land." This is in 1215, you guys. And although it took a long time for modern ideas regarding the due process to form, this clause from 1215 in the Magna Carta was laid the foundation for the Fifth and the Sixth Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so those weren't, due process of law, being able to not just, have one person be judge, jury, and executioner, but that you are judged by your peers, and then, the crime fits the punishment type of deal, right? The Magna Carta stated that in 1215. And we use it, hundreds of years later in the U.S. Constitution. Now, granted, the Magna Carta was intended to grant these protections only to English barons, okay, so only to nobility, who were at the time in revolt against King John in 1215. But by the time of the American Revolution, English subjects, both in England and in North America, had really come to regard the document, the Magna Carta, as a cornerstone of liberty for men of all stations. It wasn't just about nobility anymore by the time we, get from 1215 to 1775. But the people, what they realized is that there was a right that had been recognized by King John in 1215, and it was a right that they had possessed long before then. This is just the first time that the government is saying, hey, we recognize that we have a responsibility to you. However, the rights protected by the Magna Carta had been granted by a king, and therefore, in theory, a future king or queen could take them away. Whereas John Locke, the natural rights that he describes, had been granted by God, and therefore can never be abolished by any human person, not even royal ones, and not by any institutions that people created, okay, because God is the ultimate authority, not people. And that's a big difference between the Magna Carta and John Locke's ideas. And just to, pepper in some more stuff that we stole from England, the British were actually so committed to the protection of these natural rights that when the Royal Stuart dynasty began to intrude upon these rights that had been set by the Magna Carta in the 17th century, Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights in 1689, Okay, so we go from 1215 and the Magna Carta, and in the 1600s, when it started to be infringed upon, they passed the English Bill of Rights. 1689, we are still 100 years away from the Bill of Rights for the United States of America, people. And the English Bill of Rights was really heavily influenced by Locke's ideas because Locke was a main thinker of the time. And it explicitly guaranteed rights to life, liberty, and property. Now, this document would profoundly influence the U.S. Constitution and our own Bill of Rights. Remember, the people living in the colonies, they really did believe that they were Englishmen. They didn't see themselves as anything different, so of course it had an influence on us. Now, American colonists also shared Locke's concept of property rights. According to Locke, anyone who invested labor in the commons is the land, the forest, water, animals, and other parts of nature that were free for taking, might take as much as they needed, by cutting trees, for example, in order to build a fence around a field, but they were restricted, it was kind of like a, I forget what it's called, like an honor system. It was like an honor system. The only restriction that you had was that no one takes so much that others were deprived of their right to also take from the commons. So you were only supposed to take from the land, water, animals, forest, etc., enough for you and your family to live off of, but not so much that you were depriving others of the rights. And in the colonists' eyes, all free white males should have the right to acquire property, and once it had been acquired, it was then the government's duty to protect it. The rights of women and non-whites remained greatly limited for many, many, many more years, so we are strictly talking about free white males who owned land, which were the only people who really could own land at the time. Women were not allowed to, and neither were non-whites. This is why the colonists expected the English government to help them during the French and Indian War. So a big part of all of the taxes imposed by the British on the colonists were because the British felt that the colonists should have dealt with the French and Indian War by themselves, whereas the colonists felt that it was the responsibility of the English government to protect their property because of the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, and they were Englishmen. And so it's really a big, giant miscommunication. Now, perhaps the most important of Locke's ideas that influenced the British settlers of North America were those regarding the origins and the purpose of government. Now, most Europeans at the time believed the institution of the monarchy had been created by God. So kings and queens ruled divinely, right? They ruled because God appointed them to rule, and so they ruled by divine purpose, divine right. Excuse me. Locke, however, John Locke, he theorized that human beings, not God, had created government. So monarchs were claiming that, they were divinely appointed by God. But John Locke says, no, governments are created by people. And people sacrificed a small portion of their freedom and consented to be ruled in exchange for the government's protection of their life, their liberty, and their property. Now, really let that sink in, because this is really a huge concept, even in our government today. Okay, you sacrifice a small portion of your freedom in exchange for the government's protection. Think of small things like a speed limit, right? You agree as a driver that you will drive that speed limit because it's for the greater good of people, right? And in exchange for that, the government gives you, discounts on insurance or whatever it is. So those are that's on a much smaller scale, but just think of it that way, right? So you sacrifice a small portion of your freedom and you consent to be ruled in exchange for the government's protection of your life, your liberty, and your property. Now, Locke called this implicit agreement between a people and their government a social contract. Now, should a government deprive its people of their rights by abusing the power given to it, the contract was therefore broken and the people were no longer bound by its terms. This is important, right? If the government does not provide you protection for your life, your liberty, and your property, then you no longer have to sacrifice that small portion of your freedom. In fact, the social contract has been broken and you are no longer bound by the terms of said social contract. The people could thus withdraw their consent to obey and form another government that will actually protect their lives, their liberty, and their property. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because the Declaration of Independence says this, quote, that whatever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Right? It's written right there. These are John Locke's ideas just being regurgitated in our most sacred documents. Now, the belief that government should not deprive people of their liberties and should be restricted in its power over citizens' lives was a very important factor in the controversial decision made by the American colonies to declare independence from England in 1776. For Locke, withdrawing consent to be ruled by an established government and forming a new one meant replacing one monarch with another monarch. Okay, John Locke was absolutely in no way saying, hey, by the way, you should replace a monarch with, oh my God, a democratic republic. Are you crazy? So even John Locke was a product of his time. He believed it just meant getting rid of one monarch and establishing another monarch. But for the colonists who were intent on rebelling, it meant establishing an entirely new nation and creating a completely different type of government, one that would be greatly limited in its power that it could exercise over the people, because that's one of the biggest fears of the colonists, right? The government having too much power over them. So they wanted to create a government that was limited, one that could not exercise a ton of power over the people. The desire to limit the power of the government is so closely related to belief that, people should be allowed to govern themselves. This core tenet of American political thought was rooted in a variety of traditions. The British government did allow for a degree of self-government. We saw that in the early colonial assemblies. We saw that in the Mayflower Compact and all of those things that we talked about a couple weeks ago. Laws were made by Parliament, and property-owning males were allowed to vote for representatives in Parliament. That's still a sort of sense of self-government. Thus, Americans were already accustomed to the idea of a representative government from the very beginning. So it's not like we just woke up and decided, hey, we don't want to have a monarchy. Americans were already in a world where the Magna Carta and the British Bill of Rights existed, where John Locke's ideas were widely accepted by a lot of different people, where you already had self-government because we're an ocean away and we couldn't wait on Great Britain to tell us what we could and couldn't do. So we were already ready and prepared for a representative government. Now let's talk about slavery and the Declaration of Independence, because here's the thing. Thomas Jefferson was born to a slave-owning family, and he himself notoriously, owned slaves. As chairman of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote a paragraph condemning slavery in his very first draft of the Declaration of Independence. He included this paragraph in his list of complaints against King George III, but before the final version of the Declaration was adopted, this paragraph was deleted. The paragraph said this, quote, King George III has waged a cruel war against human nature itself. He has taken away the most sacred right of life and liberty from a distant people who never offended him. He did this by captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere if they did not die a miserable death and their transportation to the New World. These disgraceful practices are the warfare of a Christian king of Great Britain. He has stopped every attempt to prohibit or to restrain the disgusting business of slavery. He is determined to keep an open market where men are bought and sold. End quote. Now, I want you all to think about how the slavery grievance describes slavery. right? In this small paragraph, slavery is described as disgraceful and disgusting. But who does Thomas Jefferson blame for the continuation of the slave trade? Mind you, Thomas Jefferson himself has slaves. He blames Great Britain, and he blames the King of England, King George III. Now, why do you think that Thomas Jefferson wrote a paragraph about slavery when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, especially knowing that he himself owned slaves? Think about it for a couple of moments. The answer to that question is that slavery was becoming an unpopular practice in a lot of European countries at the time. Thomas Jefferson was trying to give the Americans the moral high ground by inserting this into the Declaration of Independence. But of course, as we all know, the slavery grievance didn't make it into the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But the document did claim that all men were created equal. 11 years later, in 1787, the founders drafted the United States' Constitution, and they still didn't eliminate slavery. But we'll discuss that when we talk about the Constitution next week, or 2 weeks from now, I can't remember when it is. This raises the question, why did the Founding Fathers keep slavery in the Constitution if the Declaration of Independence claimed that all men were created equal? Well, there are three prominent theories. Theory number one is that the men of the Constitutional Convention never considered getting rid of slavery at all. They just wanted to give the colonists the moral high ground during declaring independence, so that way other European countries would side with the United States and not with Great Britain. The revolutionary talk of freedom and equality really had been left behind once, the war had been won. So Americans in general, and the men of the convention in particular, wanted a united, well-ordered, and prosperous society in which private property, which included slaves, would be secure. That's theory number one. Theory number two is that the Founding Fathers' racism was a barrier to anti-slavery. And here again, Jefferson epitomizes the age, okay? Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. He did not believe that all men were created equal. That is a fact. If he had believed that, he wouldn't have owned slaves. He was a racist. He was incapable of rising above the thought of his time and his place, and he was willing to profit from slave labor. Now, few of us entirely escape our times and places. Thomas Jefferson did not achieve greatness in his personal life. Was he a great man outside of his personal life? Yeah, he wrote amazing things like the Declaration of Independence. But he had a slave as a mistress, and he lied about it. He once tried to bribe a hostile reporter who was going to let this out. And his war record also wasn't good. He spent much of his life in intellectual pursuits in which he excelled, and not enough in lending his fellow Americans, not enough in leading his fellow Americans towards great goals by example. So yes, did he make intellectual pursuits? Absolutely. He was an incredibly intelligent man, but he didn't spend enough time trying to lead his fellow Americans towards greater goals. He did not achieve personal greatness in his life. Thomas Jefferson surely knew that slavery was wrong, but he didn't have the courage to lead the way to emancipation. Thomas Jefferson epitomized the fear that free blacks and free whites simply could not live harmoniously in America. So he and others justified their actions and argued that the only way Africans could be free is if they were sent back to Africa. So theory number two is quite literally the Founding Fathers were racist. And the last and final theory is that the Founding Fathers were more determined to fashion a new nation that would bring about the end of slavery. Theory number three is that the Founding Fathers were more determined to fashion a new nation than they were to find a way to bring about the end of slavery. This is a way to candy coat the Founding Fathers and just say, oh, they just really, that wasn't on their top priority list. And it's kind of true. Slavery hung over the Philadelphia Convention. The Second Continental Congress, where and then later when the Constitution is going to be signed, it it hung over the signing of the Constitution, and it even threatened to divide the northern and the southern states because the North wanted to pretty much get rid of slavery, and the South was like, absolutely not. Now, this argument states that the founding fathers were more worried about making sure our government could stand on its own and believed that the issue of Indians, slaves, and women would be, something that young men in politics would address in later generations. And well, we all know how that worked out. Women don't get the right to vote for another 200 years. In fact, this year, 2020, marks 100 years that women have had the right to vote. Slaves are going to be around for another 100 years. And then we're not even going to talk about all the, racial inequality that is still around, even though slavery's been gone for more than 100 years. And all of the, stigmatism against Native Americans. The list goes on and on and on. The founding fathers were a bunch of racists, and that's what it boils down to. Okay, they were concerned about white land owning men, and that was just how it was. They were out for number one. Okay, the United States, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence is not the multicultural, amazing things that we make them out to be. It was not fashioned for everyday people. It was fashioned to protect the people in power, which were white landowning men. And that is the Declaration of Independence.